Let me go ahead and
There we go.
perfect. We got it. Yay. Thank you for the reminder, Kristen. That is important. We definitely want the recording to ha be available for us. Thank you. Thank you. Alrighty, so about Natalie, she is an education writer and the author of Beyond the Science of Reading, Connecting Literacy Instruction to the Science of Learning, and The Knowledge Gap, the Hidden Cause of America's Broken Education System and How to Fix It. She is also the co-author of The Writing Revolution, a guide to advancing thinking through writing in all subjects and grades. Natalie's Substack newsletter, Minding the Gap, is also available. She is also the host of a six-part podcast called Reading Comprehension Revisited, which was the inaugural season of the Knowledge Matters podcast produced by Knowledge Matters campaign. So we're so excited. She's going to talk about her book, Beyond the Science of Reading, Connecting Literacy Instruction to the Science of Learning. Natalie, please go ahead and share your screen, and you may take it from here.
Great. Thank you, Tirath. I'm just going to just give me a second and should be able to, there we go, see my screen and my slides. So thank you for having me. I'm going to be talking about this is the title of my most recent book, Beyond the Science of Reading, Connecting Literacy Instruction to the Science of Learning. And this is not to mean be taken to mean, okay, we're done with the science of reading, let's move on. It is more about expanding the definition of the science of reading to encompass all of the scientific evidence related to reading, including reading comprehension, and connecting all of that to the science of learning. So, just briefly, what we'll be covering is why we do need to expand that definition of the science of reading to include the role of knowledge and comprehension, and why our typical approach to teaching reading comprehension, which focuses on skills, is not really backed by scientific evidence. How science-informed instruction can enable students to read and write at a higher level. How you can identify an effective knowledge building curriculum, and how to overcome some potential obstacles to successfully implementing a knowledge building curriculum. But let's start with reading. And probably you, like me, like a lot of people, have been hearing a lot about reading over the last several years. These are just some of the headlines I've seen in the mainstream media about reading. And it is great that a spotlight is being trained on some serious problems with the way we've been trying to teach kids to read. And a lot of this coverage has been sparked by the work of Emily Hanford. If you have not listened to Sold a Story or some of her other audio documentaries, podcasts, I highly recommend them. And it's great that this attention is being paid to these problems. But there is one word that does keep coming up in this coverage in the media: phonics. Now, don't get me wrong, I am not against systematic phonics instruction. It is crucial if we want all kids to become proficient readers. But sometimes even the phrase science of reading is reduced in the media to phonics or more phonics. Now, it's not that science of reading advocates say that that's all that's involved. Everybody acknowledges that there's more to reading than just phonics. There's, comprehension, for example. But because the spotlight has been focused on just this one set of problems with reading instruction, the assumption has arisen that if we just fix the phonics problem, everything will be fine. Um, so that is what reading reform has focused on, and almost every state now has adopted a policy or legislation focused on really the phonics problem. Or I'm using phonics as a shorthand for foundational skills, but things like dyslexia screening, teacher training in foundational reading skills, third grade retention. So, what happens when states focus on those reforms? Well, some researchers have looked at that, and what they've found is that those states, they do get a bump in state reading test scores at third grade, fourth grade, fifth grade, but then that bump fades out. It's like you didn't do it. And so the key finding here is, someone, you don't have to believe me, this is someone with a PhD. The key finding is that adopting any of these early literacy policies that are focused on phonics is going to improve elementary students' reading achievement on those state tests, but those effects will fade out by middle school. So why would that be? Are kids suddenly forgetting how to decode when they reach sixth grade? No, but there are at least a couple of factors involved here. And one is that the words do become harder to decode, even more multisyllabic words, and we do need to pay attention to that. But the other thing that's going on here, as testing experts will agree, is that what becomes crucial to reading proficiency as the grade levels go up, beyond just the ability to decode the words, is the ability to comprehend increasingly complex text. So that suggests that something has also been missing from our approach to teaching reading comprehension. So, what have we been doing? What's the typical approach? Well, it focuses on comprehension skills and strategies. Often there's a skill of the week. So, these are things like finding the main idea and key details or making inferences. This is just one list I found online. And these skills, many of them are sort of enshrined in most state literacy standards. So these standards don't tell you what texts students should be reading. They are all about skills, things like asking and answering questions, determining the central message, or pretty much same thing as finding the main idea, describing characters in a story, their traits, motivations, etc. And so now, understandably, teachers feel this is what they should be focusing on, are these skills. That should be the goal of instruction. And so often the teacher will model the skill for the class using a text chosen not for what it's about, but for how well it demonstrates, it lends itself to demonstrating the skill of comparing and contrasting or whatever the skill of the week is. And then the other part of this approach has kids practice whatever the skill is on books or texts that have been determined to be at their individual reading level, which could be well below their grade level, but if you're a level E or whatever, you'll be directed to the basket of books that corresponds to your reading level. And these books, again, are not categorized by what they're about, but by things like how long are the sentences, how commonly used is the vocabulary. And the theory is that if kids diligently practice a skill like finding the main idea on texts on random topics that are pretty much, easy enough for them to read and understand on their own, that they will master that skill of finding the main idea and be able to apply it to find the main idea of anything they try to read, whether it's a passage on an end of the year reading test or a textbook down the road in high school or a newspaper article, whatever. If you're good at finding the main idea, you'll be able to find the main idea. So we're just going to very briefly test out that theory. I'm going to show you a paragraph taken from a newspaper, ask you to find the main idea. I'm sure you're all expert readers, so this shouldn't be a challenge. So I'll give you a minute to read the paragraph. Now, I can't see your faces, but I am imagining there's some puzzled looks out there. Unless maybe you're from the United Kingdom or someplace else where cricket is played, because this is in fact describing part of a cricket match. And what I didn't tell you is I took this from a British newspaper. So if you happen to be a cricket fan, you probably have no trouble understanding what this paragraph is trying to tell you. If, like me, like most Americans, you don't know anything about cricket, well, sure, you can decode these words, but they don't add up to anything particularly meaningful. So this is something that cognitive scientists who study reading comprehension have known about for quite some time now. So back in the late 1980s, there a couple of researchers wanted to know what is more important to reading comprehension. Is it those skills like finding the main idea or making inferences that appear to be measured by those standardized reading comprehension tests, or is it how much the reader knows about the topic they're reading about? And this study has come to be known as the baseball study. So they chose the topic of baseball because they were doing this with seventh and eighth graders, and they figured there are a lot of kids out there who are not generally good readers, but they do know a lot about baseball. So they divided these kids into four groups depending on how well they had scored on a standardized reading comprehension test and how much they knew about baseball. And then they gave them all a passage to read describing part of a baseball game and tested their comprehension of that passage. And what they found was that when reading about baseball, what really made the difference was how much a kid knew about baseball. So this green bar, those are the poor comprehenders according to the standardized test, who were baseball experts. And this blue bar, those are the good comprehenders according to the test, who did not know much about baseball. So, as you can see, when the poor comprehenders were reading about a topic they knew a lot about, there was actually no problem with their comprehension. So, this is not just one study. There are many studies like this, and just a whole bunch of evidence that having knowledge of the topic you're reading about is very helpful to comprehension. And what these studies tell us are a couple of things. First of all, that a skill like finding the main idea, it's not a skill like riding a bike, where it doesn't really matter what bike you're riding if you know how to ride a bike, but applying a skill like finding the main idea or making inferences is going to depend to a large extent on how much relevant background knowledge you have relating to the text. So they don't just get better with practice. And along with that, there's really no such thing as a fixed reading level because those measures don't take account of the topic of a text and the individual reader's knowledge of that topic. So they're just approximations and actually have been found to be no more accurate than a coin toss. So this may be fairly obvious when we're talking about baseball or cricket or molecular biology or anything that has its own specialized lingo. If you know the lingo, it's going to be a lot easier to understand a text on that topic. What may be less obvious is how much we rely on our general knowledge of the world to understand pretty much everything we read. Um, so, for example, it has been found that knowing the answer to something like where in the body does pneumonia occur is highly correlated with general reading comprehension. So that kind of more academic knowledge. Similarly, knowing the answer to a question like what mythical Greek hero demonstrated his bravery on the long journey homeward from the Trojan War, that is also highly correlated with general reading comprehension. And so what that suggests is that if we want to boost kids' reading comprehension, rather than having them practice these supposedly general skills year after year, what we really need to do is give them access to as much academic knowledge and vocabulary as possible. But that's not all that's involved in reading comprehension because it is very complicated. It is more complex than decoding and a lot more complex, and decoding is pretty complex. So we know having knowledge of the topic you're reading about, that's going to be helpful to comprehension. Having general academic knowledge and vocabulary will be helpful to general reading comprehension. And then in addition, there's familiarity with complex syntax or sentence structure. Because the sentence structure of written language is almost always more complex than the kind of sentence structure we use in conversation. And so even if you're a good decoder, maybe even have a good vocabulary, if you are not familiar with that complex sentence structure, it can be a real barrier to reading comprehension. For example, I came across a study of a 10-year-old boy who had average decoding ability, but he struggled with reading comprehension. And the researcher in this study read the boy this sentence: Rachel Carson, a scientist, writer, and ecologist, grew up in the rural river town of Springdale, Pennsylvania. And then she asked him, what do you know about Rachel Carson now? And the boy replied, they grew up together in the same place. Now, how would he get an answer like that from that sentence? Well, it has to do with syntax, and specifically this phrase that is known as an appositive. That's a phrase describing a noun. You see this a lot in written text, but we don't talk this way. And so this boy, being unfamiliar with this sentence structure, thought there were four different people in this sentence and they all grew up together. And you might think that's weird, but it's actually not uncommon. I came across another long-term, large-scale study finding that fewer than 10% of eighth graders can evaluate complex syntax. So this is another barrier to reading comprehension that is really not being addressed by the typical approach, because if we limit kids to texts they can, at least theoretically, read and understand on their own, those texts are likely to have pretty simple syntax and vocabulary. So when are they going to get exposure to the more complex syntax and vocabulary that will enable them to read and understand more complex text? Now, that general knowledge, general academic knowledge and vocabulary and knowledge of the rules of grammar and syntax, that is the ultimate goal, because that general knowledge is what will enable kids to read and understand texts on topics they don't already know about. But how do we enable them to acquire that general knowledge? Really, the only way is through immersing them in knowledge of lots of topics because vocabulary, words, rules of grammar, they really don't stick in a vacuum. They need a meaningful context in order to stick in long-term memory. And so expanding knowledge of topics is the way to provide that meaningful context. So I mentioned long-term memory. What is going on in the mind that makes prior relevant knowledge so helpful not only to reading comprehension, really to learning in general? Well, it has to do with the way we take in new information. And this is a diagram that illustrates something called cognitive load theory, which is a theory, but there's a lot of evidence behind it. Um, so the crucial box here is working memory. That is the aspect of our consciousness where we are taking in new information and trying to make sense of it, learning. And the thing to remember about working memory is it is very limited in its capacity. It has been found that on average, it can only hold about 4 or 5 items of new information for just about 20 seconds before it starts to become overwhelmed and we lose our ability to take in, understand, retain that new information. And that burden on working memory is known as cognitive load. Now, unfortunately, there is no reliable way to expand any individual's working memory capacity, but fortunately, there is a way around those limitations, and that has to do with long-term memory, that blue box, which is potentially infinite. So if we can just withdraw relevant information that we already have in long-term memory when we need it and bring it into working memory, we don't have to juggle that as a new item of information in working memory. And that expands the capacity of working memory to take in and absorb new information. So, for example, if you're reading about baseball and you already know what a double play is, you don't have to think about that. You don't have to go Google it, which is a tremendous burden on working memory. You can just attend to whatever new information is in that text. But there are a couple of tricks involved here. And one is we first need to transfer new information to long-term memory, and we also need to be able to retrieve it from long-term memory when we need it. So what helps with transfer is to attach meaning to the new information. And one good way to do that is to explain it to someone else in our own words. And with retrieval, what helps is practice. The more you practice retrieving an item that's, you've got somewhere in long-term memory, the more likely you are to be able to retrieve it in the future when you need it. And there are different ways to engage in retrieval practice. Quizzing is a good way. But again, a really effective way is to explain that information to someone else in your own words. So we'll come back to all of this, but for now, that's just the cognitive architecture that explains the crucial role of prior knowledge that is retained in long-term memory. So speaking of cognitive load, reading and writing, especially writing themselves, impose a very heavy cognitive load on kids when they are still learning to do these things. So for reading, we've got obviously decoding, that's a burden on working memory, fluency, reading at an appropriate pace with appropriate expression, understanding that complex syntax and vocabulary of written language. And then with writing, now writing is even harder than reading because you not only have to decode words, you have to form the letters, you have to spell the words. And then you have to organize your thoughts and you have to maybe try to vary your sentence structure and maybe try to produce that complex syntax and vocabulary of written language. And then if we ask students to read and write about unfamiliar subjects on top of all of that, that becomes a crushing cognitive load. And that is actually what we have routinely been doing because we've seen these things as sort of abstract skills that don't have much to do with background knowledge, when in fact, they do have a lot to do with it. So just to illustrate what this might look like in real life, I'm going to show you a paragraph from a released item from a third grade standardized reading comprehension test. So I'll give you a minute to read that. So this paragraph may look pretty straightforward to us as educated adults, but there are in fact a number of words and phrases in this paragraph that many third graders will not be familiar with, and especially if they don't live anywhere near the Canadian Arctic. And for those kids, finding the main idea of this paragraph is going to be like finding the main idea of that cricket paragraph if you don't know much about cricket. It's going to be pretty tough. Now, some third graders will know these words and phrases, or many of them, and they tend to be the kids who've been able to pick up that information outside of school because they probably have more highly educated parents with more resources. Maybe they the parents have read them a book, or the family has read them a book about the Canadian Arctic, or taken them to a museum, or maybe on a cruise to Alaska, whatever. But the other kids, they depend on school for this kind of information. And unfortunately, in our current system, they've been the least likely to get it there. So, why is that? Well, it has to do with the way we have been allocating time in the elementary school day. So, just a quick quiz. How much time on average do you think American elementary students spend each day on these subjects? Well, I don't have to keep you in suspense. The federal government actually collected data on this, and as reported by schools, they found the average amount of time on ELA was 120 minutes a day or 2 hours a day, about 80 minutes on math, and as reported by schools, 30 minutes a day for science and social studies. Now, I've been in a lot of schools and talked to a lot of teachers, and I think that is an overestimate of how much science and social studies most American elementary school students are getting. There may be time in the school schedule for one of those things 2 or 3 times a week at the end of the school day, but often even that time ends up getting reallocated to one of the tested subjects, reading or math. And that is particularly likely to happen in schools where test scores are low, which are the schools serving kids from, generally speaking, less highly educated families. And the theory is, well, if we want to get those reading test scores up, we need to spend more time on reading. And that seems to make sense. But and a lot of that time is practicing those skills that appear to be measured by the standardized tests. But let's take a closer look at this data, as some researchers did for us. They asked a couple of questions. First, they asked, so what happens if kids get an extra half an hour a day of social studies? And they found that that was correlated with higher reading test scores by fifth grade. They also asked, well, what happens if kids get an extra half an hour a day of reading or ELA? And they found that was not correlated with higher reading test scores. Now, this study can't definitively tell us why, but one likely explanation for this is that the kids who are getting more social studies were getting more of the knowledge and vocabulary they needed to understand the passages on the reading tests. And that conclusion is bolstered by a couple of additional findings. The kids from the lowest income families, they got the biggest boost from more social studies. The kids from the highest income families, they got no boost from more social studies, probably because they already knew that vocabulary. Now, that doesn't mean that rich kids don't need social studies, but it does suggest that in our well-intentioned effort to boost scores and reading outcomes for the kids who struggle the most, we have really been shooting ourselves in the foot. Now, this approach to this reading comprehension skills in the foreground and leveled reading, even if you're a good reader, it can get pretty boring to practice the same round of skills year after year on a bunch of random topics, but it definitely has its worst negative impact on certain groups of kids. So the kids who struggle with decoding, the kids who are coming into school with less academic knowledge and vocabulary, and the many kids, especially at the lower end of the socioeconomic spectrum, who fall into both of those categories. So they're going to be relegated to the lowest reading groups, limited to simple text, and deprived of access to the very thing that could help them move up. So more academic knowledge and vocabulary and complex syntax. And the situation, unfortunately, only gets worse as the years go by. So, why do I say that? Well, having prior relevant knowledge doesn't just help you understand what you're reading, it also helps you retain new information and vocabulary from what you're reading. It has been said that knowledge is like mental Velcro, it sticks best to other related knowledge. And so, one way to look at this is that some kids are coming in with more of that other half of the Velcro, more academic knowledge and vocabulary. They're going to be reading more complex text, and they're also in a good position to retain whatever new vocabulary and information is in that text because they have something for it to stick to. And so acquiring that additional vocabulary is going to enable them to understand yet more complex text. Meanwhile, the other kids who come in with less of that other half of the Velcro are going to be limited to simpler texts. That even if there's some new information or vocabulary in those texts, they're less likely to be able to retain it because they probably don't have anything for it to stick to. And so, what this leads to is a growing gap between these two groups of readers that can be very wide indeed by the time they get to high school and very difficult to narrow. And so it's been referred to as the Matthew effect in reading, which is a reference to the Gospel of Matthew in the New Testament, and basically the part that says the rich get richer and the poor get poorer. This is why it's so important to begin building academic knowledge and vocabulary as early as possible, kindergarten, because you're going to get a much bigger bang for your buck if you do that. One problem, though, is that at those early grade levels, it can look like that skills and strategies approach is working, but then it backfires when students reach upper grades. It can look like it's working with lower grade levels because the texts we generally ask kids to read at those grade levels don't assume a whole lot of academic knowledge and vocabulary. But then when they get to middle school or high school and the texts do start assuming that knowledge, if they don't have it, they can hit a wall. And there's another kind of knowledge gap that becomes most obvious in high school, although it doesn't begin there, which is the difference between what the curriculum assumes high school students know and what many of them actually do know. And this is most evident in high schools serving low income populations. Because in schools, middle schools where that's the population, this narrow focus on reading and math can continue. So kids can get to high school without ever having had systematic exposure to history, geography, science, or anything but reading and math. And that can leave them, through no fault of their own, with some very large gaps in their knowledge of the world. So they may not know the difference between a city and a state or a country and a continent. They may not be able to find the United States on a map of the world or their hometown on a map of the United States. They may not know anything much about historical events or historical figures or even have a sense of historical chronology, not because they can't learn those things, but because no one has taught them those things in a way that will make it likely to stick. And yet, we give them textbooks like this and expect them to read and understand them. And if you're missing that much knowledge of the world, this is going to be a very frustrating experience both for you and your teacher. And of course, the tests at those higher grade levels also start assuming more knowledge, vocabulary, familiarity with complex syntax. So when I stumbled across this problem, the lack of content in the elementary curriculum, our failure to start building knowledge early, I was quite surprised. Thought I knew a lot about education. I've been writing about it as a journalist for several years, but I'd never heard anyone discuss this as a problem. And so I thought, well, maybe if somebody writes a book about it that addresses it in a more engaging journalistic way, that would help get it into the public conversation about education. And so that's what I set out to do. But I didn't write the book just to describe the problem. I also wanted to know what can teachers and schools do to address these knowledge gaps, to now.
Wait, I'll go ahead and start the recording again. No
Okay,
worries.
all
Thank
right.
you, Natalie.
There we go. So, if you're reading about a topic like sea mammals, for example, you'd want to read a series of texts over 2 or 3 weeks, because kids need repeated exposure to the same concepts, the same vocabulary over a period of time for those things to really stick in long-term memory. And you want these read alouds to be probably more complex than what students themselves can read and understand, because we know that listening comprehension exceeds reading comprehension. Shouldering that cognitive work of decoding words and figuring out where the emphasis goes in a sentence for you, then you're going to have more capacity and working memory to take in new information. And the teacher can convey meaning through expression, through their fluency and of reading. So this is going to be the most efficient way to build knowledge of a new topic in the first instance is through read alouds. And also, We want to read whole texts, not just excerpts. It's going to be more engaging and it's also going to be easier to gain knowledge from whole texts. We also want to have questions that put the content in the foreground rather than the skill. And I'll show you in a few minutes what that might look like. Um, but it's not that you can never ask students to, find the main idea. It's going to be a question of what is appropriate to help them understand and think about that text. And maybe asking them, instead of saying, can you make an inference? Asking them a question about the content that implicitly requires them to make an inference. That's probably going to work better. And remember also, so the asking questions and having class discussion, that is going to help transfer this new information to long-term memory. Because remember, one way to do that is to talk about those concepts in your own words. So we want kids to do that. Now they have that information in long-term memory. So you want classroom libraries that are organized not just by reading level, but also by topic, particularly a topic that you have just spent some time reading about and talking about. Because remember the baseball study, once kids have background knowledge of a topic, they're liable to be able to read about it at a higher level. So if you've been learning about sea mammals, put out a basket of books about sea mammals at a variety of levels of difficulty, and you may be surprised by what students can do. And might see in this picture that there are some on the bottom shelf, some baskets organized by topic, but the topics are very broad. Just because you've learned about sea mammals doesn't mean you're necessarily going to understand a book about ponies, so we want to be more specific. And of course, fiction and poetry have their place in the elementary classroom, but these social studies and science topics that we've been giving very short shrift to, they seem to have the most potential to build the kind of knowledge that's going to fuel reading comprehension. And then lastly, have students write about what they're learning in a manageable way. I'll talk a bit more about writing in a few minutes, but for now, I'll just say we have evidence that when students write about what they're learning in any subject, it actually increases their learning. It improves their retention, their understanding of the information. But there is a limit to what any individual teacher can do to narrow these knowledge gaps because building knowledge is a gradual, cumulative process that extends across grade levels, and no individual teacher can control what's happening at other grade levels. So to really make progress, someone at a higher level needs to step in. So what can they do? Well, one crucial step is to adopt a content-focused, a content-rich elementary literacy curriculum that goes deeply into topics in social studies, science, the arts, and combines, including literature, and combines that with literacy instruction. And there are now a number of such curricula out there. They all cover different bodies of knowledge in different ways, but they all have a few crucial things in common. And one is that they are organized by topic rather than skill of the week, and they spend 2, 3 weeks, sometimes much more, on a topic. They also are going to give all students in the classroom access to complex grade level or above text in some way, and that could be through read alouds and discussion, so that kids are not limited by what they can decode and understand themselves. And these curricula, they will also connect the various aspects of literacy in a way that will enable kids to read and write at higher levels. So we need to remember that literacy is not just about reading or even reading and writing, it's also about listening and speaking. But listening and speaking are different from reading and writing in a crucial way, which is that they are easier. We don't have to teach kids to do those things. We've evolved as human beings to do those things naturally. And what that means is that in and of themselves, listening and speaking don't impose a burden on working memory. That's why it's going to be easier for kids to take in information about a new topic through listening if they're not yet proficient readers. And then talking about it will be a great way to transfer that information to long-term memory. And then armed with that information and long-term memory, they should be able to read at a higher level about that topic and also write at a higher level about that topic. But this only works if they're reading and writing about the same topic they've been listening to and speaking about. And often that is not the case in the typical approach. So an effective knowledge building curriculum will have kids reading and writing about the same topic they've been learning about through oral language, through that listening to read alouds and talking about. Another thing a knowledge building curriculum can do is get kids excited about reading. And we have a real problem with kids not reading for fun anymore. But we can hook them early if we use a knowledge building curriculum. So this is Dolores Fowler, was a third grade teacher who I interviewed a while ago for the podcast I hosted. She had been asked by her district to pilot a knowledge building curriculum. And Dolores, she'd been teaching for a while. She was very skeptical of this new thing they wanted her to try. And she looked at the topics that were going to be covered in this curriculum and she thought, the Vikings, ancient Rome, why would my kids be interested in that? But she gave it her best shot. She read those texts as though she told me as though they were the most fascinating things in the world. And lo and behold, her kids thought they were the most fascinating things in the world. And she told me the librarian at her school came to her and said, "What are the topics you're teaching in CKLA?" It was the name of the curriculum. Because I want to order more books because the kids are coming to the library asking for books on these topics. And I have heard this from other teachers, other school librarians. If you introduce kids to a topic or an author in an engaging way, they want to read more about that topic or more by that author. Now, you might have heard, well, you're either going to build knowledge or you're going to teach comprehension strategies. You can't do both. That's not true. It wouldn't make any sense. What the difference is what is in the foreground, and what works best is to put the content in the foreground rather than the skills and strategies. And in fact, all of these knowledge building curricula actually do incorporate strategy instruction. It may not be labeled that way, but they do ask kids to make inferences, etc., about what they're learning. And writing instruction is often the most powerful way to teach certain strategies, like finding the main idea, which is pretty much the same thing as summarizing. So let's talk about how a knowledge building curriculum not only teaches kids strategies, but enables them to actually use them. So one of the things I did for my book, The Knowledge Gap, was to follow a second grade classroom through a school year that was using one of these knowledge building curricula. Again, it happened to be CKLA. That's the oldest one, and it was the only one out there at the time. This was 10 years ago. So these kids were learning about ancient Greece, and they had had this curriculum since kindergarten. So they'd already learned about other ancient civilizations, ancient Mesopotamia, ancient Egypt, ancient India, ancient China. And one day in class, the teacher said, "So what was something unique about civilizations in ancient Greece?" And all these hands went up. And by the way, this was a school serving kids from low-income families, many of them children of immigrants. English was not their native language. All these hands went up, and she called on one little boy who came from a Spanish-speaking family, and these were his exact words. He said, "Something unique was that they weren't near a river and they didn't have any fertile soil, so it was difficult for them to farm." Now, nobody said, "Oh, you're comparing and contrasting." But in fact, he was. And in fact, he couldn't have done that if he hadn't acquired a lot of knowledge of ancient civilizations. Now, you also may have heard there's evidence for strategy instruction. And that is true. There are hundreds of studies, but that evidence doesn't really support what's going on in classrooms. So what do they studies tell us? Well, for one thing, they tell us it works best to teach multiple strategies together, not a skill of the week, one skill at a time. They tell us it works best to include background knowledge, which if you've got 25 kids reading 25, texts on 25 different topics, no one teacher will be able to provide the background knowledge they might need. It also, the studies tell us that students get all the benefits of comprehension strategy instruction after just a few hours. These meta-analyses show there's no difference between 4 hours and several hundred. So yeah, there are benefits, but they come very quickly. And clearly, we're spending too much time on this kind of instruction. And then there's also the question of how long these benefits last. These studies last no more than 6 weeks, usually. You can see results quickly, but the researchers don't come back a year later or whatever to see if the kids are still enjoying those benefits. Now, there's also evidence that building knowledge, combining that with literacy instruction, can boost comprehension eventually. It takes time. So I'll just tell you about one study that really shed some light on how much time it takes. This was a study involving 3,000 students, and it was a randomized controlled trial with a spiraling curriculum. So that means this was a science curriculum that brought back the same concepts but at a deeper level over a period of time. So in first grade, kids learned about how animals survive in their habitats. Second grade, how paleontologists study dinosaurs. Third grade, more abstract, how do living systems function properly? Now, the interesting thing about this study was that at the end of each of these grade levels, they gave kids two different kinds of tests. near transfer and far transfer. So the near transfer tests were like, well, did you learn what we taught you? Did you learn that vocabulary? And they found that at the end of each of those grade levels, the students did know what had been taught. They did better than the control group. The far transfer tests tested them on, reading passages that had nothing to do with what they'd learned, didn't use that vocabulary. And they found no far transfer until the end of third grade. With lasting effects in fourth grade, by the way, even though the kids were not getting this curriculum anymore in fourth grade. Now, the key point here is that standardized reading comprehension tests are all far transfer. They are not testing kids on the vocabulary or whatever that they've been taught. And what this means is it's going to take time for kids to acquire that sort of critical mass of general academic vocabulary that's going to enable them to understand passages on tests that don't relate to anything they've already learned about. It's going to take time to see these results. It's very hard. It's very expensive to have studies that last 3 years or more. So we are never going to have as many studies of knowledge building and reading comprehension as we have of strategy instruction, because it's just easier to study strategy instruction, but it doesn't mean it's better. You may see changes in classrooms, however, much more quickly. Here is Dolores again. So Dolores was teaching at a school that served a mostly well-educated population, but she did have a few kids from less highly educated families. And one year she had two girls in her class from those kinds of families, and they both had IEPs, so they'd been diagnosed with learning disabilities. And she was worried about them. She thought, this is really complex stuff. Are they going to be able to keep up? Will they understand it? But what she found was they were actually even more invested than the other students, she told me, because they had not been exposed to any of this before. It was all new. They were fascinated. They were sitting at the front of the classroom, hanging on her every word. And when they were learning about the Vikings, there was a text about a blacksmith, and it mentioned the word anvil. And Abby raised her hand and said, "What's an anvil?" And Dolores explained it and showed her a picture of an anvil. And then months later, the class was working on a completely different topic. They were learning about clouds. And Dolores showed a picture of some clouds, and Abby raised her hand and said, "That cloud looks like an anvil." And Dolores told me she felt like she had to go out of the classroom and have a little cry, because it meant that Abby and Sarah, they were actually acquiring this vocabulary. It was making a difference to them. And in fact, so they'd started the year, both of them, at a kindergarten reading level. And by the end of third grade, they were reading at a second grade level, and those gains continued in fourth grade. So I'd just like to take you briefly into a couple of classrooms, early elementary classrooms that I followed through a school year, to compare that skills-focused approach with a knowledge-building approach. These classrooms were not identical. One was first grade, one was second grade, but they were similar in many ways. The kids were all from low-income families. They were all children of color, and the teachers were good, hardworking, dedicated teachers. But what was going on in these classrooms was like they were on different planets. And I think that was because of the curriculum, what the teacher had been asked to teach. So this is a typical anchor chart poster from the skills-focused classroom. It was very hard for the teacher to engage these kids in a discussion of, sequence of events or the difference between a caption and a subtitle. They just didn't have much to say about that. This is a typical poster from the content-focused knowledge-building curriculum classroom. This was from a unit on Greek myths, the myth of Daedalus and Icarus. The kids in this classroom were highly engaged. They loved Greek myths, but they also loved the War of 1812. We really underestimate what kids can get interested in if it's presented engagingly. There are a couple of things I'd like to point out about this chart, and one is the vocabulary words of the day desperately plummeted in foresight. Now, these kids mostly came from non-English speaking families. Some were still learning English themselves, but they were using words like these not only in class, but sometimes in their conversation outside of class. These are not words that they're going to see on a third or fourth or fifth grade reading test, but they will be expected to know these words in years to come. And these words will be sitting in long-term memory for them, waiting to be retrieved. They will remember these words because they're encountering them in a vivid, engaging context, like this word plummeted shows up at the bottom. Icarus's wings melted and he plummeted into the sea. So we have to be thinking about not just what vocabulary do kids need to understand what they can read now, but also what are they going to be assumed to know 10 years from now and start planting the seeds of that success. The other thing I'd like to point out about this poster is it illustrates what I mean about putting content rather than skills in the foreground. So it could look like this teacher is teaching comprehension skills. She's got this question predict and these boxes labeled cause and effect. But she's not trying to teach the abstract skill of determining cause and effect and using a text to teach the skill. She's bringing that skill in to help students think about and understand this text. And she's not just asking, can you make a prediction? She's asking a question about the content. What is Daedalus's plan that implicitly requires kids to make a prediction? So I've been talking about how we need content in the curriculum, and that's important, but how we teach that content is also important. So this is a Substack newsletter that I recommend called The Learning Scientists, and a piece about teaching for more equitable outcomes, the missing ingredient. So what's the missing ingredient? It is actually making sure that kids are learning. And how do we do that? Well, study after study has shown that teaching with explicit instruction helps all students succeed, but it helps disadvantaged students the most. So, what is explicit instruction? Well, it's not just lecturing, it's highly interactive, but it does mean when it's a new topic, providing fully guided instruction rather than inquiry or discovery. There's a lot of review or that retrieval practice I mentioned earlier, checking for understanding, having students elaborate, so asking how and why questions about things once they've got some information. Lots of guided practice before expecting students to do complex things on their own. So, how can teachers incorporate these practices into their teaching? Well, writing instruction, when combined with a content rich curriculum, can actually provide many of those elements. It provides retrieval practice, for example. When we write, we have to retrieve information, we have to elaborate on it. Writing activities can be a great check for understanding. And so writing instruction has enormous potential power, but we haven't unlocked it because we've underestimated how hard writing is. And we've also tried to teach it in isolation from content. So to unlock its power, we need to do three things at least. We need to modulate that heavy cognitive load that writing imposes, and that could mean starting at the sentence level if that's what kids need. Teaching grammar and syntax through students' own writing is probably the only thing that's going to work for most students. And again, starting at the sentence level is very helpful for that. And then embedding writing activities as much as possible in the content of the core curriculum so that it's being used to reinforce the knowledge we want them to retain. And I know I'm familiar with only one method that combines all three of those principles, and that's the writing revolution. So I'm the co-author of the book, but the method was developed by my co-author, Judith Hochman, who's a veteran educator. So just to give you a quick example of what one of the sentence level activities looks like from the writing revolution, this is an activity called Because, But, and So. So you give students a sentence stem that they need to complete with each of these conjunctions. Let's say they're learning about ancient India. So you could give them this sentence stem and that they need to complete with because, but, and so. Each of these is going to ask for a different kind of information that they need to retrieve from long-term memory and put in their own words. So it's going to be retrieval practice, elaboration, and also familiarizing them with these conjunctions, which not all students just naturally know how to use. So there are different possible responses, but here are some of them. And teaching writing beginning at the sentence level can improve reading comprehension. Remember the student who thought there were four different people in this sentence? What can we do? Well, teach students what an appositive is and have them supply the appositive for this sentence. So this is accomplishing two things at the same time. It's familiarizing them with this sentence structure, which is going to enable them to understand it when they encounter it in their reading. And it's also serving as retrieval practice and elaboration for this content. So effective writing instruction can turbocharge any content-rich curriculum, but if you're jumping from topic to topic because the focus is on skills, kids may not be able to acquire enough information about any one topic to enable them to write about it. So how can you tell if a curriculum actually builds knowledge effectively? Well, just briefly, some red flags to watch out for. If there's too much content to cover in one school year, If there's the content is, or not too much content, but too much stuff, there might be stuff that's not really rich content. There might be thin content or themes rather than topics, and that is not going to be as engaging or give students that repeated exposure to the same concepts and vocabulary that they need. Could be introducing new information without enough background knowledge, putting skills and strategies in the foreground rather than the content, relying too much on those leveled texts, and the writing prompts not being linked to curriculum content is a problem. And then excerpts rather than whole texts. That's also something to watch out for. So some curricula out there are now labeled knowledge building, but they're not really. So I call them faux knowledge building curriculum. So, for example, this is a second grade unit on plants and animals in their habitats. Only 4 texts. These texts are quite simple. They're really designed for second graders to be able to read them. And they're not building on each other. One's about worms, one's about ladybugs, birds, and one is a poem about a mouse. Um, and they're not providing all the knowledge kids need to even understand these texts. So in that flyaway ladybug text, there's a mention that ladybugs eat juicy aphids, but it's not explained what aphids are. And then it just says gardeners buy the ladybugs. If you don't know that aphids eat plants, you don't understand why gardeners would buy them. And that poem, I, Mouse, the mouse talks about jumping into a swimming pool, roaring at a thunderstorm, thumbing its nose at an owl. It's not clear that, this is not literally true because it's just mixed in there with these nonfiction texts. And it's not even explained that mice don't actually have thumbs. So this could be very confusing for kids. This is a kindergarten unit from a true knowledge building curriculum, much more about plants, building on each one builds on what's been introduced previously. There's a lot of repetition of key vocabulary. This is going to be much more effective. So adopting a knowledge building curriculum is crucial, but not enough to guarantee successful implementation because there may be obstacles. And one of those could be testing, those standardized tests, not just the end of the year tests, but also interim tests that are supposed to predict performance on end of the year tests, could be giving teachers feedback like your kids need more practice on making inferences. And that could lead them to change the lessons to focus on skills. And then there's instructional incoherence. And I'll just say briefly, if, this is like tutoring or tier 2, 3 interventions that don't relate to what kids are supposed to be doing in class. And that can just add to their cognitive load and really not be helpful at all. And then there could be other obstacles like intellectual obstacles because this is so unfamiliar. It's natural to be skeptical of something that's not only unfamiliar, but actually contradicts a lot of what you may have heard. There could be emotional obstacles because teachers have, teaching in a certain way for years in the good faith belief that they're helping kids. And then if someone says, well, maybe not, that's a very painful message to take in. And then lastly, there could be behavioral obstacles because teaching is such a complex activity. It's hard to remember to do things differently in the moment. It's not impossible to overcome these obstacles, but teachers may need some support, like why they're being asked to change, the curriculum materials that they need, and also coaching on how to deliver those materials in the best possible way for their particular students. But basically, instead of seeing all these things as separate, reading, writing, content areas, we need to recognize that reading and writing are complementary parts of literacy and that both of those things are really part of learning, that they draw on everything we've been able to learn and they are in themselves ways of learning. So it's all connected. And in practice, what that means is every literacy teacher also needs to be a content teacher and vice versa. And I'll just end with a quick anecdote that I heard when I was researching my book, The Knowledge Gap, about a second grade teacher who was at a school that had adopted a knowledge building curriculum, but they were still doing leveled reading. So she was giving one of her second graders a test to determine his individual reading level. And this was a little boy who struggled like crazy with reading. But the teacher saw in the testing kit there was a text on the topic of westward expansion. And that was the topic that the class had just spent a couple of weeks learning about through read alouds and discussion. But the text was at a 4th grade reading level, and this was a struggling 2nd grade reader. Just out of curiosity, the teacher handed the text to the boy to see what he could do with it. And to her surprise, he read it with 98% accuracy and 100% comprehension. which I think changed her idea of who that little boy was and what he could do. And it probably changed that little boy's idea of what he could do as well. And this is one reason I feel so much urgency about this topic. We have, with the best of intentions, made untold numbers of children feel like they are failures, when in fact it's the system that's failed them. So thank you very much. And I will stop there.
Thank you so much, Natalie. Oh my gosh, that was incredible. I took so many notes, and I could tell a lot of people were looking down, so I'm sure they were taking notes. So much great knowledge and really so valuable. It made me reflect a lot on my teaching practices, I'll be honest. When you showed the pictures of the anchor charts, it made me think about how have I been doing the anchor chart. So thank you for sharing all of those pieces. We do have, since we're short on time, we have about a minute left. I'll go ahead and share my screen because we would love to do the giveaway now. Let me go ahead and get that going for us. As we wrap it up, we've had the chance to select the people who will be the winners of the giveaway. Alrighty, so again, we'll conclude our session with Natalie here, and we will do the giveaways now. Carlin, please go ahead. Kristen,
And
did you want to add something?
let's stop record.
Carlin, could you stop the recording, please? And whenever you're ready,